Since the time I was young, I've been victimized as part of a marginalized minority. Obviously, at first I was unaware that I was anything special until one day a teacher all of a sudden slapped me, referred to me as a moral deviant and a tool of the devil, and then forcefully tried to convert me. What was it that she noticed about me that bothered her so much that she even told my parents? I couldn't have been more than 4 years old at the time, but the immoral offense that provoked her was the fact that I was coloring with my left hand. You see, later, on the ride home, I found out she was a devout Christian who believed that my left-handedness was something sinister and simply not right with God. No pun intended. Despite growing up and having to conform to right-handed structures in society, I never had any other incidences as dramatic as that first one until a recent trip to Ghana in West Africa. There on a mission trip, I was reminded of my so-called deviance when I began guest teaching in a room full of third graders. I was simply writing my name on the board when the class suddenly erupted into laughter, finger-pointing, and name-calling. Their teacher just stood there, snickering to herself. To make matters worse, the next morning while going up to receive communion at Mass, I was again reminded of the left-handed stigma when the priest hesitated to put the host into my palm. He awkwardly rearranged my hands to place the Blessed Eucharist so that my right hand would be used to consume it. He then proceeded to lecture the entire congregation on the proper way to receive communion. All of us lefties on that trip forced ourselves to comply for the remainder of the time we were there. So why so much prejudice against being left-handed? Left-handedness is mentioned 25 times in the Judeo-Christian Bible, describing it as someone deserving of a lesser blessing, as conniving, as a fool, as someone cursed into everlasting fire with the devil. It was also believed that Eve was developed from Adam's left side, resulting in left-handedness not only being associated with femininity, but consequently, inferiority. During the Spanish Inquisition, the Catholic Church would condemn and occasionally execute those who used their left hand. Likewise, across the Atlantic at the Salem witch trials, left-handedness was one of the many pieces of evidence used to implicate those suspected of witchcraft. At the turn of the 20th century, the left hand was looked at by scientists as not the mark of the devil, but as the result of a biological abnormality, labeling those of us who possess this trait as primitive, abnormal, uncivilized, and more inclined to commit a crime. Psychoanalysts even came to see lefties as a sign of homosexuality or general sexual deviancy, including incest and perversion. As the century progressed, educators viewed left-handed students not as pupils, but as problems. Some teachers, like the one I mentioned from 30 years ago, resolved to retrain left-handed students to write with their right hands, in spite of the mental, emotional, and psychological distress that it could lead to. In the 1970s, left-handed children were considered academically and behaviorally challenged and disposed to diseases including schizophrenia. In the 2 decades that followed, psychologists noted that left-handed people lived shorter, poorer lives, and that being left-handed was the result of a neurological insult or physical malfunctioning. The word itself doesn't help us either. The Old English meaning of left meant weak, idle, foolish, whereas right meant just, good, fair, proper, fitting, and straight. This series, of course, isn't about science, educational theory, or linguistics, so I'm not going to attempt to explain any of those latter points, but I can at least tackle the biblical and theological perspectives on left-handedness. As always, it's important when reading anything, especially scripture, to look at the history of the text, including authorship, audience, and the culture in which it was written. While the Bible does record characters assuming right-centric cultural norms, it doesn't state that rebuking the left-hand side is valid. For instance, Jacob used his left hand to give a lesser blessing to Joseph's older son, but it was still a good blessing. Left-handed warriors were singled out for their skill in battle, and Matthew chapter 20 shows that being seated at the left side of the king was still a coveted position of authority and power. One main historical reason for the dirty perception of the left comes down to toiletry habits. Left has been associated with uncleanliness by societies who lacked plumbing and the modern luxury of toilet paper. After relieving oneself, one was required to clean themselves using their non-dominant hand. And so it would have been considered offensive to use that hand for any other purpose, including holding a fork, shaking hands with others, waving, or even simply raising that hand higher than the waist level. You wouldn't serve dinner on a toilet bowl, right? Then why would you use your toilet hand for anything other than uncleanliness? And hence the reputation of the left being dirty. If you think this sounds crazy, men, take a look at where the flush valve is the next time you use a urinal. In short, this is yet another example of theological cultural appropriation. God does not hate lefties, nor does God favor the right. Scripture scribes simply wrote to specific audiences who were already using their non-dominant hands to clean their heinies, and so the right-handed preference found its way into the actions of the Bible. Overall, you have to admit it's pretty silly to think that a society would categorize a population's entire moral character and self-worth based on one physical trait that they were born with and, for all intents and purposes, doesn't do a single thing to hurt other people. It's silly to think that unless a person was willing to undergo the emotional and psychological distress of a forced conversion, that they would be accused of being a tool of the devil and thus worthy of damnation. It's also silly to know that this trait has been offensively labeled as a biological abnormality, or unnatural if you will, and that it's a sign of degeneracy and sexual perversion that poses a threat to families and society. But I guess this is the cross we must continue to bear, all for having the audacity to want to follow through on our inborn inclination to write with our left hand.